Devon, 1944. The January air presses cold and sharp against the sand as a small group of British engineers stand motionless, their silhouettes barely visible against the grey surf. In the half-light of early morning, something massive and circular waits at the edge of the water. Two colossal wooden wheels linked by a steel drum, its cords taut, its bolts glinting dully. The sea murmurs, steady and indifferent, as if unaware of the violence about to be tested in its shallows. A distant signal flare arcs quietly into the sky. The men shift uneasily. They have gathered to witness a machine intended to carve a path through fortress walls. Yet even here, miles from enemy fire, the air is thick with apprehension. The device seems almost alive in its stillness, as though holding a breath of its own. In this video, we explore the British wartime invention built for moments exactly like this, the Great Panjandrum. A machine so great that the army it was built for feared its very existence. But to understand why such a machine was conceived at all, we must first consider the nature of the problem Britain faced. By late 1943, Allied planners faced a dilemma that had no easy, comfortable answer. Any invasion of occupied Europe would require breaching some of the most formidable coastal defences ever constructed. The German Atlantic Wall, a vast system of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, reinforced concrete emplacements and dense minefields, stood as a literal barrier between Allied forces and the continent they needed to liberate. Every yard of beach could become a killing ground if the first waves were stalled, pinned, or broken. Conventional engineering methods offered little reassurance. Royal engineers were experienced, ingenious, and courageous, but even their most reliable tools struggled against the problem of breaching thick concrete under direct enemy fire. Demolitions teams could approach obstacles only by exposing themselves to machine gun nests. Tanks fitted with explosive charges or adapted dozer blades risked bogging down on loose sand or being disabled before they reached their targets. Each solution was met with the same grim reality. Anything slow, predictable, or manned became a target. The challenge was not merely to destroy fortifications, but to do so quickly, from a distance, and without sacrificing the first men ashore. Every delay increased the likelihood of catastrophic casualties. Allied planners feared a scenario in which infantry became trapped on open sand, while obstacles remained intact, leaving columns of advancing troops funneled into exposed, deadly lanes. The urgency was unmistakable. With the timetable for an invasion tightening, the need for something bold, even unorthodox, began to feel unavoidable. It was in this environment that British minds were pushed toward ideas that would never have been considered in peacetime. At a time when resources were stretched, materials restricted, and secrecy absolute, unconventional thinking was not simply tolerated, but quietly encouraged. This was the era of strange prototypes, experimental contraptions and devices that seemed to defy traditional military logic. The pressure to find a rapid, standoff solution to breaching sea defences opened the door to concepts that could bypass human vulnerability altogether. And within workshops, drawing offices and coastal testing grounds, a notion began to form. If men and tanks could not safely reach the obstacles, perhaps something unmanned, something expendable, could. Something that could race across the sands with unstoppable momentum, carrying enough explosive power to tear open a path where none existed. But to see how such an audacious idea took shape, we have to follow the engineers and scientists who were asked to turn this growing desperation into a workable design. The idea that would eventually lead to the Panjandrum emerged from the most unconventional corner of wartime British engineering, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, better known simply as the DMWD. This small, creative, and often eccentric organization had already experimented with unusual naval and amphibious devices. Its mission was deliberately broad, to explore ideas considered too speculative, too strange, or too unorthodox for standard military development channels. Within the DMWD, the challenge of breaching heavily fortified sea defenses was being discussed with increasing urgency. Planners feared that the first landing craft in a major amphibious assault would be met not only with gunfire, but with deep layers of concrete obstacles designed specifically to halt armor. If a way could be found to clear a path without exposing engineers, the balance of risk on invasion day could shift dramatically. The initial concept was strikingly simple in theory, a massive, freely rolling wheel device powered by rocket motors carrying a large explosive charge. It would be launched from a landing craft, reach full speed across the wet sand, and smash into defensive structures with enough force to detonate a powerful payload. The guiding philosophy was clear: momentum instead of manpower, speed instead of stealth, destruction without direct sacrifice. But simplicity on paper did not translate to simplicity in reality. Engineers faced immediate challenges. The wheels had to be large enough to roll over beach obstacles and maintain stability on uneven surfaces. They needed a structure strong enough to withstand rocket thrust but light enough to accelerate rapidly. Cordite rockets, simple, battlefield-ready propulsion units, were chosen for their availability and power, but they produced unpredictable torque and uneven thrust. Every design choice balanced on the edge between control and chaos. The DMWD's workshops became a hive of hands-on experimentation. Models were built in miniature to observe basic behavior. Larger prototypes followed, constructed from timber, steel, and lengths of rope meant to brace the assembly under violent acceleration. As the scale increased, so did the risks. Engineers recalled later that even in static form, the device seemed barely manageable. Once in motion, it demanded a level of bravery, or perhaps stubbornness, simply to stand near it during testing. Despite these risks, the project gathered momentum because it solved a pressing operational question. How could engineers deliver more than a ton of explosive against a fortified seawall without committing soldiers to near-suicidal roles? A remotely delivered device, launched directly from the sea, appeared to offer a rare combination of safety and destructive potential. There was, too, a subtle psychological pressure at work. The Allies were developing a wide array of invasion tools: amphibious tanks, specialized engineering vehicles, floating roadways, and more. In such an environment, even highly experimental ideas were given the benefit of the doubt. If the Panjandrum worked, it could become a dramatic solution to a terrifying problem. If it failed, it would fail quietly, behind closed gates and restricted coastlines. With each iteration, the device grew larger, heavier, and more ambitious. Additional rockets were added to improve acceleration. Bracing cables were strengthened. The drum at the center, intended to hold a vast explosive charge, became more robust. Yet with every improvement came a new question: would these changes create stability or amplify the machine's already volatile nature? The only way to know was to build it full scale and let it loose on the sand. And when the engineers finally revealed what they had constructed, it was unlike anything Britain had attempted before. What emerged on the Devon coast was a machine that looked less like a weapon and more like an industrial experiment that had broken free of its workshop. Known simply as the Great Panjandrum, it consisted of two enormous wooden wheels, each around 10 feet in diameter, connected by a central steel drum strong enough to house a substantial explosive charge. Along the outer rims, racks of cordite rockets were mounted in symmetrical rows, their nozzles angled to drive the wheels forward with tremendous force. There was no operator, no steering mechanism, no armor, no guidance fins, and no internal electronics. The Panjandrum relied entirely on raw propulsion, geometry, and accumulated momentum. Its purpose was brutally straightforward: to race across a beach at high speed, collide with a concrete seawall, and detonate with enough power to punch a hole through which tanks and infantry could pass. To observers seeing it for the first time, it must have seemed both ingenious and faintly alarming. A weapon defined not by precision, but by overwhelming kinetic violence. Its simplicity was part necessity and part wartime pragmatism. If it could stay upright and maintain a straight course, it promised a solution that no established tool had yet provided. But understanding what the Panjandrum truly was, and why it behaved as it did, requires a closer look at its engineering, where promise and peril were intertwined at every turn. At its heart, the Panjandrum was a machine built on brutally simple physics. Yet its behavior revealed just how unforgiving those physics could be when translated into full-scale wartime engineering. The construction began with the twin wheels, each crafted from thick wooden segments bolted to radial spokes. Timber was chosen not for elegance but for availability and speed. The DMWD needed large, rigid wheels, and wood offered a workable compromise between strength and weight. These wheels were enormous and their sheer diameter was deliberate. They had to remain effective on soft, uneven sand, where smaller wheels would dig in, stall, or collapse under the shock of impact. Connecting the two wheels was a central steel drum, the true functional core of the device. This cylindrical container was designed to carry a significant explosive charge. Documentation suggests a payload in the region of a ton of gelignite or a similar demolition compound. It had to remain stable under violent acceleration and rotational forces, meaning its construction was heavy, reinforced, and intentionally over-engineered. If the Panjandrum reached its target at the speeds imagined, the drum had to survive the journey until the precise moment of impact. Propulsion came from cordite rocket motors, the same simple battlefield rockets used for barrage purposes or improvised propulsion in other DMWD experiments. Each was strapped along the inner edges of the wheels, angled so that their exhaust would push the assembly forward. On paper, balanced thrust from both wheels would drive the Panjandrum in a straight line. In practice, each rocket burned at slightly different intensities, producing uneven torque that could nudge the machine off course. As tests progressed, more rockets were added in a bid to increase speed and overcome drag from sand and surf. This only compounded the instability. The Panjandrum's acceleration was immense, but the forces acting on it became increasingly difficult to predict. Engineers introduced bracing cables between the wheels in an attempt to keep the assembly rigid during violent motion, but these cables introduced their own problems. If a cable snapped under load, and they often did, the entire machine could begin to wobble or veer erratically. The design had no steering system, and with no operator aboard, control relied entirely on symmetry. If each wheel accelerated evenly, the Panjandrum moved forward. If one set of rockets misfired, it turned. If several cut out unexpectedly, the device could swerve, arc, or even topple. There was no built-in braking mechanism. Once launched, the machine's trajectory belonged to the laws of motion alone. One of the most distinctive challenges came from the rocket exhaust itself. The burning cordite produced unpredictable side thrust and vibration. Some rockets detached mid-run, whipping away wildly. Others continued to burn while partially detached, creating lateral forces that pushed the wheels into sudden, jerking rotations. Each test added new data, but also new unpredictability. Comparatively, other wartime devices that used rocket propulsion, such as rocket-assisted torpedoes or demolition charges, were either guided, stabilized, or designed to operate in a medium like water, where drag could dampen instability. The Panjandrum had no such moderating environment. It ran on open sand, exposed to wind, slope, and surface irregularities. The larger it became, the more its own structural stresses worked against it. Despite these engineering obstacles, the theory behind the design was sound. Speed, momentum, and explosive force could bypass the dangers that human engineers would face under fire. But the practical realities became increasingly clear. The Panjandrum was both powerful and temperamental, a device with immense potential, but no natural limits once in motion. And it was precisely this volatile blend of promise and risk that came into sharp focus when tests were carried out on the Devon coast, returning us to the uneasy tension of that cold shoreline. Back on the sands of Devon, the Panjandrum never looked entirely at rest. Even before ignition, its size alone seemed to press unease into the air. Engineers stood at what they judged to be a safe distance, though safe was a relative term when confronted with a device built to hurl itself forward under the force of dozens of rockets. The surf rolled in slowly, indifferent to the men and machinery poised at its edge. When the rockets were lit, there was no gradual build-up, only a sudden eruption of flame, smoke, and violent rotation. The wheels began to turn with a force that felt disproportionate to the rough, improvised materials holding them together. In those first seconds, when thrust and friction fought each other, the machine either found its line or immediately betrayed its instability. Onlookers knew they could not intervene once it slipped free. The beach offered no hiding place from something so large, so unpredictable, and so heavily charged. This moment, that breath held collectively by every witness, captured the heart of the Panjandrum story, an invention that carried enormous promise, yet felt perilously close to chaos from the instant it moved. To understand just how it behaved under real testing conditions, we have to look closely at what the trials revealed. The first full-scale trials of the Panjandrum were conducted on the long, open beaches around Devon, one of the few stretches of coastline where secrecy, space, and tidal conditions aligned. These tests were intended to answer the most fundamental question: could the machine maintain a straight, stable run long enough to strike a target with meaningful accuracy? Early attempts revealed the difficulties immediately. With only a modest number of rockets attached, the Panjandrum tended to lurch forward briefly before slowing, the wet sand dragging at its wheels. Engineers responded by adding more rockets, arranging them in tighter clusters along the rims. The thrust increased dramatically, but so did the machine's volatility. When the expanded rocket banks were ignited, the Panjandrum often surged ahead with unexpected violence. Each motor contributed its own slight variation in burn rate, causing momentary shifts in direction. A single, misaligned rocket could drag an entire wheel off its intended course. Observers noted that the machine would sometimes pivot sharply, then correct itself, then veer again, behavior that suggested a constant battle between planned trajectory and the unpredictable physics of raw propulsion. Cables added between the wheels were meant to provide structural stability, but under high acceleration, they sometimes snapped with a loud, whip-like crack. When that happened, the Panjandrum's wobble intensified, and any hope for directional consistency vanished. At least one test reportedly saw the machine veering toward groups of observers, forcing them to scatter behind improvised shelters. Although accounts differ in detail, the consistent theme is clear. Even those accustomed to experimental weapons felt a peculiar dread when the Panjandrum went off course. The noise was another challenge. The simultaneous firing of dozens of cordite rockets produced an unnerving chorus, a mixture of high-pitched screeching, deep rumbling, and the erratic sputter of motors failing mid-burn. Unlike the steady thrust of a rocket engine, these simple motors varied wildly in performance. Flameouts launched the machine sideways, detached rockets spiraled away in unpredictable arcs, some continued to burn even after tumbling loose, carving erratic paths across the sand. Yet not everything was failure. Some test runs did demonstrate the potential within the design. When the rockets burned evenly and the surface cooperated, the Panjandrum could reach considerable speed and maintain a relatively straight line. Observers noted that during these brief moments, the device gave a credible impression of the destructive force it might deliver against a fortified seawall. Its mass, acceleration, and projected explosive charge suggested a capability for serious demolition. However, those successes were sporadic, and the inconsistencies overshadowed them. The Panjandrum could perform impressively one moment and become a hazard the next. Its dependence on symmetrical thrust made it exquisitely sensitive to minor imperfections in construction, rocket alignment, or environmental conditions. The wetness of the sand, the angle of the beach, and even coastal winds played roles in its erratic movement. The DMWD made repeated modifications, more rockets, different cable arrangements, adjustments to wheel spacing, but each improvement introduced new points of failure. As the tests continued, it became increasingly clear that while the Panjandrum's destructive concept was sound in theory, its real-world behavior resisted predictability. And that raised the question that mattered most to planners. Could such a machine ever be trusted on the chaos of an enemy-held beach? As trials continued into 1944, the Panjandrum's fate became increasingly tied to a single concern: reliability. Allied planners preparing for the invasion of Europe could accept many forms of risk, but they could not accept unpredictability on the shoreline of a defended beach. Every landing craft, every tank, every infantry platoon depended on timing and coordination. A device that behaved differently from one test to the next introduced an element of chaos that no commander could reasonably tolerate. Records suggest that senior officers, naval observers, and engineering liaison staff all watched at least some of the Panjandrum's later runs. What they saw reinforced doubts already raised by the DMWD's own engineers. The machine had power, and it certainly had destructive potential, but it lacked the one quality essential for operational deployment: control. Even under carefully arranged test conditions, it could veer unpredictably, stall, overturn, or turn back toward its launch point. In a live invasion environment, with uneven sand, obstacles, craters, and the intense pressure of enemy fire, its behavior would likely be even more erratic. There was also the question of scale. To carry a charge large enough to breach reinforced concrete, the Panjandrum needed to be enormous. This made storage, transport, and handling increasingly cumbersome. Launching one from a landing craft during the assault phase would have required exceptional precision, and any mishap during deployment could have put friendly forces at significant risk. Because of these concerns, the Panjandrum never progressed beyond testing. There is no evidence to suggest that it was formally allocated to any assault units, nor that it was transported to operational staging areas. By early 1944, as the invasion of Normandy approached, Allied engineering doctrine increasingly favored solutions that could be delivered by tanks, specialist engineer vehicles, or combat engineers using portable charges. These methods were familiar, proven, and predictable, everything the Panjandrum was not. By mid-1944, the project had quietly slipped into obscurity. It was not cancelled amid fanfare or controversy. It simply faded as the momentum of other, more dependable innovations overtook it. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Great Panjandrum was not among their tools. The invasion succeeded through a combination of overwhelming force, specialized armored vehicles, and the relentless work of engineers on the ground, not through the dramatic arrival of a rocket-propelled wheel. In the end, the Panjandrum remains a reminder of a particular wartime moment, when the pressure to solve an impossible problem allowed even the wildest ideas to be explored. And yet, its story did not vanish completely, for although it never saw battle, traces of its existence survive today. It stands as one of the most striking symbols of the DMWD's willingness to explore unorthodox ideas, a period when the extreme pressures of the war created space for experiments that might, in calmer times, have been dismissed outright. For many historians, the Panjandrum represents the outer boundary of wartime improvisation, a project that was bold, imaginative, and technically daring, yet ultimately too unpredictable to survive the scrutiny of real combat requirements. Surviving physical remnants of the Panjandrum are scarce. The devices constructed for testing were largely dismantled or destroyed once trials ceased. The combination of timber, metal fixtures, and exposed cordite rockets meant that little was designed to endure beyond the testing period. Most components were reused or scrapped as material shortages pressed the need for conservation. As a result, no complete Panjandrum is known to survive today, and collectors have identified only a handful of minor fragments, often attributed with cautious uncertainty, from the Westward Ho testing grounds. What does remain, however, is a small but meaningful record in photographs, test reports, and wartime film footage. These documents, held by institutions such as the Imperial War Museum and various archival repositories, allow historians and engineers to examine the machine's unusual construction and observe its unpredictable behavior during trials. The footage in particular has contributed to the Panjandrum's enduring notoriety. Its dramatic, erratic test runs, wheels shuddering, rockets spraying sparks, and engineers diving for safety, have cemented its reputation as both an ingenious creation and an undeniable hazard. Back on that bleak Devon coastline, where mist clung low to the sand and the sea rolled in with its steady, indifferent rhythm, the engineers who witnessed the Panjandrum's trials must have felt a mixture of apprehension, pride, and quiet resignation. They had stood in the half-light, watching a machine born from urgency and imagination tear itself into motion. They had seen its promise flare and its instability reveal itself just as quickly. In those moments of ignition, when fire and smoke wrapped around those towering wheels, the Panjandrum embodied both the determination and the desperation of a nation preparing for a perilous assault. Today, looking back at that silent stretch of beach, the machine feels less like a failed weapon and more like a symbol of wartime Britain's willingness to explore ideas at the very edge of practicality. It represented a belief that there might still be some undiscovered solution waiting in the margins, something bold enough to carve a path through concrete and fear alike. The Panjandrum never reached a battlefield, and perhaps that was inevitable. But in its brief, volatile life, it captured the spirit of a moment when the stakes were so high that even the strangest machines were given their chance to prove themselves. And as the tide washed over its footprints on that remote shore, the engineers who stood there understood something quietly profound. Not every invention was destined for glory, yet each one revealed how far Britain was willing to go in the face of an uncertain dawn.